morning, everyone. My name is Robin Wauters. As Peter mentioned, I've been writing about the technology industry for a little more than a decade now. A few years at TechCrunch, a few years at the Next Web. A few years ago, started my own publication. And the reason that I did that, let me see if my slides work. There you go. Oops. There we go. Sorry. So this is my first time in Gdansk. This is my first time at Infoshare, and I figured I would share some information. And what I really know best is the European technology industry. When I was at TechCrunch, I was writing about global innovation. I was writing a lot about US startups from 2008 to 2012, because there wasn't really that much happening in Europe. All of that kind of changed in 2010. There was like a whole new momentum where I started getting more interest in what's happening in Europe. And I became the European technology editor for the Next Web. And this momentum didn't stop. In fact, it accelerated. So I started thinking, like, how do we measure this growth? How do we put it in comparison with other regions? How do we actually see if we're doing well? How do you see if we're growing? So this is what I set out to do when I started Tech.eu. This is what our website looks like today. I'm showing a screenshot of the website because it's easier for me to kind of explain what we do. We have a weekly, you can see in the top menu, we do news, we cover news. We have a newsletter, we have a podcast, we list events, we organize events as well, we partner with events. But reports is probably the most interesting thing that we do. We track a lot of data, and data can mean a lot of things. What we track is mostly business-related data, like funding, M&A, IPOs. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only benchmark. It's just that it's easier to measure and easier to compare and easier to track growth. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can track innovation or interesting companies or interesting people. It's very, very hard to measure that. But what we do track is data, the stuff that you can measure and compare. So I'm pulling some data from recent reports to show you how we're doing in Europe. And that comes with two warnings. One is that when we look at Europe, as Tech.eu, we made a conscious decision to actually include places like Russia, Israel, Turkey. So it's not necessarily only the EU, so keep that in mind. And the other thing is that, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is the only thing that's happening in Europe. In fact, some of the companies that don't raise funding, that are bootstrapped, may come up with the most interesting innovations and the most interesting entrepreneurs, for that matter. But all right, how is Europe doing? If you look at the media, usually it's either horrible or it's very well. And quite recently, if you look at recent headlines about Europe, and this is from a number of different publications, I think we're doing fine. I mean, never been a better time to be an entrepreneur in Europe, which is true. Silicon Valley betting big on Europe, both in terms of investments and acquisitions, also true. Europe leading in fintech and smart city projects, etc. Also true. Acquisitions, I'll come back to that later, also happening quite regularly, and the deals are getting bigger. But the funny one was Europe's surprising tech success. That was a headline, like, for me, if you've been covering this for more than 10 years, it's not really surprising. What is surprising is that it's actually continuous and that it's happening all over the place. So I'm going to try and showcase that through data. Number one is looking at the stats for 2016. So this is all of last year. Do not pay attention to the blue bubbles, because that was 2 quarters ago. The red bubbles show you the total for the year. If you track all of the funding rounds, you come to about 3,500 almost number of deals. And you come up with a number about 16.2 billion euros invested into startups. Now, I know very well that this pales in comparison to the numbers that you would see in places like the US and China even. But the most important thing is that it's growing. It was up almost 12% in terms of investment volume compared to 2015. It was up a tremendous 32%, so almost a third more deals in 2016 than we saw in 2015. What that tells you is that the number of seed deals, Series A, the smaller early stage startups getting funded more often, more frequently, bigger rounds, and all over Europe rather than concentrated in a few hubs. In terms of verticals, I don't think it's much of a surprise when I tell you that the core of the European technology industry is very, very much B2B. It doesn't really show that in the numbers always, because a lot of the gaming companies and the music streaming companies, you know, the Spotifys and the SoundClouds and the Deezers, they tend to get a lot of the headlines, and they tend to get a lot of the big deals, and it kind of skews the numbers. But if you dig into the numbers a little deeper, then you will clearly see that it's B2B all over. That's really the core of the European tech industry. It's software as a service, it's marketing tech, it's fintech, it's health related, it's biotech. But there's also a lot of deep technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence that we're really good at. Deep talent pool, really good universities, really good business schools. I probably don't need to tell you this as you live in Europe, most of you at least. But that's very much the case. The top 3 funding rounds in 2016 won't be much of a surprise to you. So we're going to skip that. Don't pay attention to the middle part, because I'm going to dig into it a little deeper in a later slide. But 2 things you need to remember from this slide. One is that the most active investors in Europe, and this was true in 2015, 2016, it's going to be true this year, and probably going to be true for a long time, is government-backed investment vehicles. BPI France is a French investment bank, but it's really owned by the French government. High-Tech Gründerfonds is a very regional German investor, but they're backed by the German government, and they're very, very active. They're very, very prolific. And even the ones, the professional VC firms like Index and Kima and Global Founders, have, in one way or another, been funded by European institutions, mostly the European Investment Fund. So on the other side of the slide, you can see the top countries by number of deals. And what's interesting about that is that it's not much of a surprise that the big countries like Israel, Germany, France, UK are listed very high. What is really interesting is that France wasn't even there in 2015. And in 2016, had the most number of funding deals in all of Europe. And what that tells you is that government is actually quite important. When I was young and naive and stupid, I would say, the best thing the government can do is get out of the way of entrepreneurs. Try not to make their life hard. Just stay out the way and let the entrepreneurs do whatever they do, and just let them blossom and flourish. But the reality is, if you have a very, very active policy as a government to stimulate entrepreneurship, to encourage startups to scale, and you actually have a policy in place like France does with the startup visa and La French Tech, which is more like a marketing campaign to kind of showcase French technology to the rest of the world. And you can see that it's actually working out quite well. They're getting a lot of more interested from foreign investors and acquirers than they used to. And a lot of it has to do with what the government actually did for the startup scene. And you can also see that in the UK, by the way. So this shows a little bit better the growth that we're seeing in the last few years. I have to say 2012, 2013 are numbers from a different source because we weren't tracking data back then. It might be a little bit higher, so it might not be that dramatical of an increase. But the trend is clear. I mean, European technology companies are raising more funding every year. It's pretty linear growth. You can see the number of deals go up quite steadily. The investment volume rises quite steadily as well. It's not exponential growth. It's not that it's growing like crazy. I can't really say that. If you look at the data, there's growth, there's maturation, there are encouraging signs, it's not slowing down. But you can't really say that it's growing at the rates that we see in the US or China. But that doesn't matter, as long as we're growing. Investment volume, again, I don't think it's much of a surprise that the big countries in Europe, the big economies, are taking the bulk of activity. One exception is Italy, for the 4th largest economy in Europe. They're actually not doing that well in terms of investment. But Poland's in there. They're at the bottom, but they're still there. The largest rounds, not really important, but you can see what is important is that when you look at the top funding rounds, the one thing that I notice when I look at the statistics of this graph is that these companies are all over the place in terms of vertical, right? They're gaming companies, they're music streaming, they're hardware, they're deep tech, they're travel, they're e-commerce, they're fashion, all over the place. You can't really pinpoint, if you look at only the top funding rounds, what Europe is really good at. You have to dig a little bit deeper for that. Now, this is the trend for Q1 2017. Not slowing down, quite the contrary. We are slowing down a little bit in terms of number of deals. But you can see if you raise if European startups raise 4.5 billion in one quarter, if you can do the math, then we're probably going to end up with a record year again. We're probably going to end up around 18 to 20 billion euros in total investment by the end of the year. So that's quite encouraging. Still, fintech, health, marketing tech, B2B mostly. The UK is doing quite well. France is doing well again. But of course, what good is all this funding and this financing if these companies don't end up generating a return for their investors through acquisitions or IPOs? So we're going to look at that as well. If you look in 2016, so this is again for the full year last year, most of the transactions were acquisitions. And look, Poland's in there again with Allegro. It was kind of a big deal. And what's apparent from this graph, or this slide, is that if you look at all the top funding countries and the top activity, Finland wasn't in there, Poland wasn't in there, the Netherlands wasn't in there, but 3 of the 5 big VC deals, or VC exits last year, were actually from those countries. So you can see that it doesn't necessarily mean if all the funding goes to a certain country that all the acquisitions are going to happen in that country as well. About 660 deals, which was kind of slightly down from the year before, but the investment volume went up about 8%. 160 billion euros worth of acquisitions, and these are only the ones that were disclosed in size, so the number's actually a lot higher than that. One takeaway maybe from this slide as well, VC exits. So this is acquisitions or IPOs from companies that have received funding from professional investors. It's actually quite low. In fact, most exits that happen, double the amount of exits, more than double the amount of exits, are from companies that weren't invested in. So VC exits, you don't have to pay attention to the middle part, that's just names of companies and names of investors. If you look at top verticals, it's interesting to see that most of the funding going to fintech, also most acquisitions and IPOs happening in fintech. So Europe is really, really good in financial services on a global scale. Most of the exits that happen are acquisitions. We don't see a lot of IPOs, we don't see a lot of mergers in Europe. And the top countries won't be much of a surprise. What may be surprising is that the United States, like American companies buy most European tech companies. I don't think that's much of a surprise, but the rate is very, very clearly, there's a big margin between number 2 and the US. So it's still the US buying up all these companies for good reason, because they're affordable, the valuations tend to be lower, the talent pool is very deep, and usually the acquisitions happen a lot faster because European tech companies tend to be more willing to sell than most American companies, which is a cultural issue, mostly. For Q1, kind of the same trend, about 20 billion euros worth of deals in the first quarter this year, which is actually quite low. If you look at the 160 billion for total for last year. A couple of big acquisitions, Social Point in gaming, Mobileye in transportation tech. And the number of deals actually up compared to the first quarter of last year. So again, this is a slightly different representation. You can clearly see that 2016 was a really, really big year for acquisitions, mostly because of the fourth quarter. Usually it takes a couple of very, very big deals, like SoftBank buying ARM and whatnot, to really, really scoop the numbers. So we'll see if that trend continues. Otherwise, we might actually see a little bit of a decrease in terms of total value. This slide I really like. These are all the companies, these are some American companies or global tech giants that have bought European tech companies in 2016. And it's basically all of them. It's Airbnb, it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's Microsoft. They're all buying European tech companies. This is only last year, right? The only company that was missing in this list, Apple, right? Which was very surprising because Apple usually buys a lot of European tech companies. At least they may have bought some but not disclosed it, which is always a possibility. But Apple didn't buy a single company and published it, or was public about it in 2016. And of course, this quarter that all changed because they just bought a Finnish company last week, or they announced that they bought a Finnish company last week. I'm showing this headline just to showcase that the momentum is not really slowing down. It's quite the contrary. Improbable raising $500 million from a single investor. Silk Ventures, I'd never heard of it. They announced a $500 million fund to invest in European tech. Delivery Hero just raised almost 400 million euros. Creditech, almost 110 million euros. Cabify, 100 million. all of these headlines were in the last 7 days, the last week. This all happened in the last week, or was announced in the last week, just to show you that it's going to be another killer quarter, and by the end of the year, we'll break records again, which is very encouraging. This is a statistic, or a chart that I really like. It's not from any of our reports. This is actually from a report from Atomico and Slush. They released it in, I think, November 2016, basically to showcase that there's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur. And one of the things that they highlighted is the number of events. It could be conferences like this one, but it's also like small meetups, it's workshops, it's people getting together. And you can see the numbers clearly going up. They highlighted a few of the big hubs, Berlin, London, Stockholm. But you can really see it everywhere. I get asked the question quite often, especially in America. So what's the interesting, where do we need to be? What's the most interesting city or country or region in Europe that we need to be in? And I tell them I don't know. I honestly don't. Whenever I go to London, I look for different things. It's a mature market, so is it maturing faster? Is it really growing at the rate that it should, at the point that they are now? When I go to Slovenia or Tallinn or Poland for that matter, I look for different things. What was the data like 2 years ago? Is it growing? Is there a community? Is there a real ecosystem? Is there a government that's actively involved in creating policies for entrepreneurs and to benefit from this momentum? Are there VC firms? Do you have angel investors getting organized? Do you have lots of meetups? These are some of the things I look at. And then it really doesn't matter where you go. I remember the founders of SoundCloud, who are Swedish, by the way, they're considered a Berlin success story. And one of the founders once told me that when they had to decide where they were going to establish their company, they had like a checklist. It has to be a creative city, it has to be beautiful, the weather can't be too horrible. And the only reason they're in Berlin is because it checked most of the boxes. Could have been Barcelona, could have been Lisbon. It didn't really matter to them as long as they had, creative capital, well-connected airport, because they knew they had to travel a lot. So that just tells you, like, where you are, where you're born, where you go to school, doesn't really matter all that much. And this is also an Atomico. When they researched all of this, their assumption was that everything was getting centralized. That most people would, act as, or most cities would act like a talent magnet, and that most of it would get centralized in London, Berlin, Stockholm, Paris. And the reality is that's not really happening, especially with the new technologies and the new trends, artificial intelligence, VR, etc. It's increasingly happening in places like, Zurich or Ljubljana, or whenever there's a good university that kind of specializes in a certain field that's getting a lot of momentum. Cambridge is another good example. So instead of centralizing in a few hubs, kind of the opposite is happening. You can see really interesting technology, really interesting innovation, really good companies as well, coming from all over Europe, which I think is very interesting. Of course, there are problems. We can't say that everything's going well. We have to tackle a few problems that are still ahead. Fragmentation, it's always going to be there. Europe is not a homogeneous market. Europe is not, it's always going to have different cultures and languages, so that makes it hard for companies to grow quite rapidly across borders. We don't have a digital single market, so even as an e-commerce, particularly as a marketplace, it's very, very difficult to grow across borders. So these problems are not going to go away. You can kind of fix small parts of it, but you can't fix all of it, especially not in a short time. The other thing is that funding going to early stage companies is fine, and that the fact that this is increasing is fine, but you can see a very clear gap in late stage. Whenever you go up to Series C, Series D, and up, Europe has a bit of a problem. We don't have a lot of the big monster rounds yet. You can see a few of them, but not enough to kind of make up for what we're seeing in the rest of the world. There aren't enough companies, big corporates in Europe buying European technology companies. So still, most of this technology and this talent eventually goes to the US and increasingly Asia, which, take it any way you want, might be a problem, might be an opportunity as well. I remember I did some very minor work for Neelie Kroes when she was commissioner for digital. And I remember she had a slogan once which said, she was saying, start in Europe, grow in Europe, and stay in Europe. And I would always question the last part. Like, well, why would you want to stay in Europe? Go wherever it makes sense. Start in Europe, yes, grow in Europe if you can, fine. But then go wherever you want. If your future is in the US or Asia, then by all means, go there. If your partners, your customers are there, your potential acquirers, go there. But come back. That's always very important. Whenever I see successful entrepreneurs from Europe making it big in the US, and they give back to the local community, not just financially, but also through support, mentorship, supporting the right organizations, that's always how ecosystems really, really grow. This is something that I'm particularly interested in personally. I travel around Europe to talk to interesting entrepreneurs and companies. It's a horrible job, but someone has to do it. But the interesting part is you get to see why ecosystems are the way they are. Why do they exist in the first place? Why do they grow? And a lot of times that's because of successful entrepreneurs acting as role models, giving back to the community. So the more that happens, the better for Europe. That's it for me. This is me. You can find me on Twitter, send me an email, and you can also ask me questions now if you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Any questions? Who wants to know more where to find the money?
It's always very embarrassing if nobody asks a question, so please.
Oh, don't be afraid, because I would say I would kindly invite you to start, grow, and stay in Gdansk.
Okay, you ask me a question. Oh, we have a question here. You have a mic?
Yeah, otherwise I run down.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I have one question. Did you see in your analysis any influence or maybe start or beginning how Chinese companies are influencing the tech environment in Europe?
Oh, yes, definitely. Through acquisitions and investment, I didn't isolate it, but it might be an interesting analysis to make in the next few weeks. But yes, they were nowhere in the last 2-3 years ago. You wouldn't see Chinese companies doing anything unless it was below the radar. And now they're very openly investing. And when they invest big. They invest not millions, but tens of millions and hundreds of millions. When they make acquisitions, it's big ones. Might be problematic, might be an opportunity, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that the fact that the US is buying most European technology companies, the only way that will change is when Asia, and especially China, gets more active. I don't think European companies will eventually become the biggest acquirers of other European tech companies. It will be China. They're investing, we're talking about hundreds of billions of venture capital that eventually in the next 5 to 10 years are going to flow to Chinese companies, but all over the world as well. They have tremendous scale. They can provide European technologies when they buy or invest in it. They can provide much more scale, much more learnings from sometimes 1 billion users rather than just a few millions, right? So it's increasingly interesting for European tech companies as well to go down that route.
Robin, we're here.
Yeah.
Hey, Robin. You mentioned about that majority of the deals when it comes to Europe are acquisitions, and the number of IPOs is quite low. Are you guys tracking the information for all the local IPOs that are happening?
Yeah.
Like in Poland, you have the New Connect that also allows kind of a way out for all of the people that are there, and that number seems a bit low, like only 16 deals. So,
yeah, we track very, very small deals in very, very local exchanges. So these are all of them. At least that we know of. Maybe we missed a few, but you can always pinpoint them to me. I can send you a list if you want. But it's true that we actually see a little bit more smaller IPOs than we used to. What we don't see is the big IPOs. And that's the problem, right? Well, it might be a problem, I don't know. But you can also see that in the US, kind of like people, well, the big private companies are increasingly staying private a lot longer. I mean, look at Uber. Look at Facebook, how long they took to go public. It's a new world, and IPOs are no longer the one big goal for entrepreneurs to have that big exit. But I mean, it'd be probably helpful if we had more IPOs, just because, especially if it's local exchanges, because that kind of keeps the money flowing domestically or internally.
Hi, Robin. I love Tech.eu. It's great. Hi.
Hi.
Area.
Simon.
Do you think that venture capitalists and private equity are becoming perhaps a little bit more gentle in their negotiations with entrepreneurs over time? So, for example, less restrictive in terms of the kind of money they put in Series A with respect to these various clauses that they can enter. In Europe, have you seen that, or is it still quite restrictive?
Yes. Two main reasons I think is because entrepreneurs are smarter now. They know a lot better how venture capital works. They know a lot better how to negotiate, both in terms of valuation and the amount that they're raising and who they're raising from. They're getting really smart about who they should take money from. Second reason is because it's more competitive. The US investors and Asian investors are looking more actively, bringing big coffers of money to compete with that. You have to be entrepreneur friendly, and you have to be a little bit more limited in how far you go into restrictions. You can also see the most successful VC firms in Europe in terms of the kind of company they back and the access that they have are usually the ones that are very founder friendly, usually the ones that are actually founded by people who've started their own companies in the past and aren't necessarily bankers going into private equity. So yes.
Any last question?
All right, well, thank you for joining.
Oh, no, that was not the final question. Because you say that fintech is really most hot, yeah?
Yep.
There are many entrepreneurs here, people who have ideas. Within fintech, what is, according to you, really the domain to focus on?
Alternative financing, meaning peer-to-peer lending, marketplaces, crowdfunding, I think might become more interesting. It's in the news a lot. In terms of numbers, it's still relatively small. But crowdfunding, alternative financing, such as peer-to-peer lending, we're quite good at. Also, insurance technology, which we have a long history of insurance industry here in Europe as well. Probably payments at some point. Might not come from Europe, might come from the US. We'll see, but all across the board. And the interesting thing about fintech is when you look at a bank and the way they compete with startups. It's not like one startup attacking a bank. It's one startup attacking a small part of the bank, and another one attacking this part of the bank. So it's like 1,000 companies attacking you all over the place rather than...
Robin, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Warm applause, please.
Thank you.